Margaret sat on the edge of her neatly made bed, her frail hands trembling slightly as she folded a soft cotton sweater. The morning light filtered through the lace curtains, casting delicate patterns across her modest bedroom, a small sanctuary filled with memories. At 75, Margaret's body had grown frail, but her spirit remained vibrant, fueled by hope and a deep desire to reconnect with her son, David. A wave of nostalgia washed over her as she recalled the laughter they shared during his childhood, moments that felt like a lifetime ago. "Will he even want to see me?" she murmured to herself, a hint of uncertainty creeping into her voice. She paused, staring at a photograph on the dresser. A younger David, grinning widely as he held up a trophy from a science fair. The sight brought a bittersweet smile to her face. "Oh, my darling boy," she whispered, "how I've missed you. I just want the chance to tell you how proud I am." With a deep breath, Margaret continued packing, placing the sweater gently into her well-worn suitcase. Each item she folded carried a memory: her favorite shawl from her late husband, a pair of comfortable shoes for the journey, and a few homemade cookies wrapped in a small tin, just in case David had a sweet tooth. She remembered the last time they spoke, the argument that had torn them apart like a jagged scar. The anger and hurt had festered over the years, but today felt different. Today was about reconciliation. As she zipped up her suitcase, Margaret glanced around her small home, taking in her surroundings one last time. The faded wallpaper, the worn-out armchair, and the tiny kitchen filled with the scent of herbs she had dried during the summer. All of it was steeped in memories of a life lived quietly, yet richly. With a sigh, she picked up the suitcase and headed towards the door, her heart fluttering with a mixture of excitement and anxiety. "This is it," she whispered to herself, steeling her resolve. "It's time to forgive and forget." The bus station was bustling with activity, the sounds of chatter and the hum of engines filling the air as Margaret made her way to the ticket counter. She felt a momentary pang of apprehension as she watched the younger travelers rush past her, their lives seemingly so full of promise. "What am I doing here?" she thought briefly, doubt creeping in. But then she remembered David's face, his bright smile, and the warmth of his embrace. "I have to try," she told herself, stepping up to the counter. "Ticket to the city, please," she said, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her stomach. "Sure thing, ma'am," the clerk replied, handing her the ticket with a friendly smile. Margaret took a deep breath as she made her way to the bus, the weight of her suitcase feeling lighter with each step. Seated by the window, she watched the scenery blur by, the familiar landscapes of her small town giving way to sprawling highways and urban sprawl. The rhythm of the bus was soothing, but her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and memories. As the bus moved along, Margaret's mind drifted back to the years that had passed since she'd last seen David. The distance between them had grown insurmountable after his success. It was as if the more he achieved, the more he drifted away. She remembered their last conversation, the heated argument that had left them both wounded. "You don't understand me, Mom," David had shouted, his voice thick with frustration. "You're still stuck in that little town while I'm trying to make something of myself." Margaret's heart ached at the memory. "I was only trying to support you, David," she had replied, but the words had fallen on deaf ears. The silence that followed had been more painful than the argument itself, a silent admission of their estrangement. Now, as she sat on the bus, she couldn't shake the feeling of dread. Would he even care that she was coming? Would he be angry that she had ventured into his world uninvited? "Maybe I should have called first," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the engine roar. She glanced at the other passengers, a mix of young and old, each lost in their own thoughts. What if he's changed? What if he doesn't want me in his life anymore? Margaret's heart raced as the bus approached the city. The skyline loomed ahead, a jagged silhouette against the setting sun, glittering like a jewel. As they pulled into the bus station, the anxious energy in her chest tightened. She stepped off the bus, her heart pounding as she was met by the cacophony of city life. The sounds of honking cars, shouting vendors, and bustling crowds swirled around her, engulfing her senses. "Just breathe," she whispered to herself, clutching her suitcase tightly. The city was foreign and overwhelming, yet it was also filled with the promise of reunion. She hailed a taxi, the driver's friendly banter a stark contrast to her inner turmoil. "Where to, ma'am?" he asked, glancing at her in the rearview mirror. The corner of 5th and Maple, please," she replied, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions within her. As they drove through the streets, she marveled at the bright lights and the energy pulsing through the air. Yet, with each passing block, her anticipation turned to anxiety. Finally, they arrived at David's apartment building, a towering structure of glass and steel that seemed to reach for the sky. Margaret stared up in awe, a mix of admiration and trepidation flooding her senses. "This is his life now," she thought, her heart heavy with the weight of their long separation. She stepped out of the taxi, feeling small and insignificant among the grandiosity of the city. As she entered the building, the opulence was overwhelming. The lobby was adorned with marble floors and elegant furnishings, a far cry from her humble home. She walked to the elevator, her hands shaking as she pressed the button for the top floor. The elevator hummed softly, the doors closing with a soft ding that echoed in her ears. "Okay, Margaret," she whispered to herself, "you can do this." But as the elevator ascended, her heart raced. Memories of David's laughter, the warmth of his embrace, and the love they once shared flooded her mind, mingling with the fear of what lay ahead. Would he open his heart to her again, or was it too late? The elevator doors slid open with a soft whoosh, and Margaret stepped into the plush hallway, feeling the plush carpet beneath her feet. She walked toward David's door, her heart pounding louder with each step. "This is it," she thought, raising her trembling hand to knock. The cool surface of the door felt foreign, as if it stood between them, a barrier to the love that had once flourished between mother and son. With a deep breath, she knocked softly, the sound echoing in the silence that enveloped her. As she waited, her heart raced with anticipation and fear, a storm of emotions swirling within her. She could only hope that behind that door lay the son she once knew, the boy who had brought her so much joy. Would he still be there, or had the years changed him beyond recognition? The door remained closed, the silence growing heavier, and Margaret felt a pang of uncertainty grip her heart. She was about to confront a past that had haunted her for far too long. Margaret stood before David's door, her heart pounding relentlessly against her chest. The polished wood loomed large, and she couldn't help but feel a wave of nostalgia mixed with trepidation wash over her. Memories of better days flickered in her mind. Family dinners filled with laughter, holidays where David, as a child, would run around the house, his face lit up with joy. But those days felt like a distant dream now, overshadowed by years of silence and hurt. She raised her trembling hand and knocked softly. The door swung open, revealing a woman in her 30s, impeccably dressed in a tailored grey suit. Her hair was neatly pulled back into a bun, and her sharp eyes appraised Margaret with a mix of curiosity and neutrality. "Hello, can I help you?" the woman asked, her voice smooth but lacking warmth. Margaret swallowed hard. "I'm Margaret, David's mother. I've come to see him." The assistant's expression shifted slightly, a hint of surprise flashing across her face. "Oh, I see. I'm Sarah, his assistant. Unfortunately, David is currently in a meeting and won't be able to join you right away." There was a practiced professionalism in her tone that made Margaret feel even more out of place. Margaret nodded slowly, her heart sinking. She had imagined their reunion so differently, filled with warmth, love, and perhaps even apologies. "How long will he be?" she inquired, trying to mask the tension in her voice. Sarah glanced at her watch. "It shouldn't be too long, but I can't say for sure. Would you like to wait here?" She stepped aside, allowing Margaret to enter the expansive, lavish apartment. As Margaret crossed the threshold, she felt a wave of disorientation wash over her. The opulence of the space was overwhelming, high ceilings adorned with intricate moldings, walls lined with modern art that she struggled to interpret, and a large window showcasing the dazzling skyline of the city. It was stunning, yes, but it felt cold and unwelcoming, much like the relationship she had with her son. "Please, have a seat," Sarah offered, gesturing toward a sleek, minimalist sofa. Margaret sat down, her fingers nervously fidgeting with the hem of her cardigan. "Can I get you something to drink? Water, coffee?" Sarah asked, her expression still businesslike. "No, thank you," Margaret replied, her throat suddenly dry. She felt an uncomfortable silence settle between them, heavy and filled with unspoken words. As the minutes dragged on, Margaret's unease grew. What if David never came? What if he had forgotten her, or worse, didn't want to see her at all? Her mind raced as she glanced around the apartment, searching for anything that might offer a glimpse into David's life. Her gaze fell upon a series of photographs displayed on the mantel. They were all of David, each image capturing a different milestone, graduation, awards, and various events that highlighted his success. But Margaret noticed something strikingly absent. There were no family pictures, no images of the two of them together, nor any of David with his childhood friends or extended family. Just David, alone and triumphant, as if he had built a life that didn't include her. As she continued to scan the room, Margaret's heart sank further when she spotted a large framed picture of David with Sarah at a gala. They stood close together, their smiles bright and intimate. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. Why was Sarah in so many of his photos, and where did that leave her? A sense of betrayal washed over her, hot and stinging. Was Sarah not just an assistant, but something more? Feeling overwhelmed, she turned her gaze back to Sarah, who was now tapping away at her phone, seemingly oblivious to Margaret's turmoil. The thought of confronting Sarah felt daunting, yet the nagging questions loomed large in Margaret's mind. She needed to know why David had chosen this woman to share his life with, especially when she had been so absent from it. "How long have you worked for David?" Margaret asked, attempting to break the silence. Sarah looked up, her expression shifting to a more polite demeanor. "I've been with him for about 3 years now. I help manage his schedule, meetings, and, well, a lot of other things." There was a hint of pride in her voice, and Margaret couldn't help but feel a twinge of jealousy. 3 years, Margaret echoed, her mind racing. "You must know him quite well then." Sarah smiled, a flicker of warmth breaking through her otherwise stoic exterior. "Yes, I do. David is an incredible person. He's passionate about his work and committed to his goals." Margaret nodded, though her heart ached at the thought of how much she had missed out on. "He was always ambitious as a child," she said softly, memories flooding back. "He wanted to be a doctor at one point, then a lawyer. I just wanted him to be happy." Sarah's expression softened a bit, but there was still a barrier between them, like a glass wall that separated their worlds. "He is happy, Mrs. Thompson," she said gently. "He works very hard to achieve what he has. It's important to him." Margaret felt a wave of sadness wash over her. Was this what happiness looked like for David? A life filled with accolades, yet devoid of family. Her heart clenched painfully at the thought. The tension in the air grew thick as they waited, punctuated only by the distant sounds of the city outside. Margaret's mind raced as she replayed every moment leading up to this visit. She had envisioned so many things: laughter, stories, perhaps even apologies. Instead, she found herself in a stranger's home, waiting for her son behind a wall of glass that seemed unbreakable. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the door to the hallway opened, and Margaret's heart leapt. But as she turned her head toward the sound, her heart sank once more. It was just a passing moment of hope. The hallway remained empty. Just then, Sarah looked up from her phone, her brows slightly furrowed. "I should check on him," she said, standing up. "Would you like to wait here, or would you prefer to see if he's available now?" Margaret hesitated. "I'll wait," she replied, though the thought of waiting any longer felt unbearable. As Sarah stepped away, Margaret was left alone in the opulent silence, grappling with the feelings of isolation and abandonment that filled the air. She glanced around the room once more, her heart heavy with a sense of foreboding. This was not the reunion she had hoped for. It was a stark reminder of the distance that had grown between her and her son. The lavishness of the apartment felt like a facade, and Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that David was hiding behind it, far from the warmth of family and the love they once shared. With each passing second, she felt the weight of betrayal deepening, threatening to suffocate her. How had they come to this? How had love been replaced by silence and resentment? She closed her eyes, inhaling deeply, trying to steady her racing heart. But as the shadows of doubt crept in, she knew one thing for certain: whatever awaited her in this apartment would change everything. Margaret sat in the plush, modern living room, her heart pounding in her chest as she anxiously awaited her son's arrival. The opulence of the apartment felt foreign to her, a stark contrast to the modest life she had led. The walls were adorned with abstract art that she couldn't make sense of, and sleek furniture that looked more like a showroom than a home. She was surrounded by a silence that felt heavy, interrupted only by the occasional sound of traffic outside. Each tick of the ornate clock on the wall seemed to echo her growing unease. After what felt like an eternity, the sound of footsteps approached, and Margaret's breath caught in her throat. The door swung open, revealing David. He looked different from the boy she remembered. His hair was meticulously styled, and he wore a tailored suit that screamed success. But the moment she laid eyes on him, she noticed the deep lines etched on his forehead and the shadows beneath his eyes, signs of stress and exhaustion. "Mom," he said, his voice a mixture of surprise and strain. He stepped forward, arms outstretched, and they embraced. The hug was awkward, and Margaret felt the tension radiating from him. He held her tightly for a moment, but quickly pulled away, his eyes darting to the floor as if he were searching for words that wouldn't come. "It's good to see you, David," she managed, her voice trembling slightly. "I've missed you." He nodded, but the way he avoided her gaze made her heart sink. "Yeah, it's been a while," he replied, his tone lacking warmth. Margaret felt the weight of their years apart pressing down on her. She could sense a wall between them, a barrier built from misunderstandings and unspoken grievances. She had come here hoping to bridge that divide, to find the son she once knew, but the man before her felt like a stranger. "Would you like some coffee?" David asked, gesturing toward the sleek kitchen. "Sure, that would be lovely," she replied, her voice quivering with hope that maybe a cup of coffee could melt the ice that had formed between them. As David busied himself in the kitchen, Margaret sat in silence, her thoughts racing. She wanted to ask him about his life, his work, and the choices he had made. But as she watched him pour the coffee, she sensed that he was still distant, lost in his own world. Finally, he joined her on the couch, setting the steaming mug in front of her. "Thank you," she said, wrapping her hands around the warm cup, relishing the heat that seeped into her palms. "So, How's everything going with your work?" David took a sip of his coffee, his expression unreadable. "Busy, always busy," he replied, glancing at his watch as if he were already mentally preparing to leave. "You know how it is." Margaret clenched her jaw, feeling a familiar rush of frustration. She had hoped for a meaningful conversation, but it felt like he was deflecting her attempts. "I'm sure it's more than just busy. You've accomplished so much. I'm proud of you, you know." "Thanks, Mom," he said, but his tone remained flat, as if the words had lost their significance. "I just have a lot on my plate right now. Meetings, projects. It never ends." Margaret felt a pang of disappointment. She wanted to connect, to understand the man her son had become, yet he seemed more interested in discussing work than family. "How about your personal life?" she ventured, her eyes hopeful. "Are you seeing anyone?" David shifted uncomfortably, pulling at the collar of his shirt. "Not really, just focused on work," he replied, his voice clipped. "Not even a girlfriend?" Margaret pressed, her heart aching. She wanted to know if he had someone to share his life with, someone who could bring him joy. "No, Mom, I told you I'm busy," he snapped, the annoyance creeping into his voice. The air between them thickened, and Margaret recoiled slightly, taken aback by his abruptness. I thought maybe you'd want to share. I mean, it's been so long since we've talked like this." "Talked like what?" David shot back, his frustration boiling over. "Like you care? You never cared before." Margaret's heart dropped. "That's not true, David. I always cared. I just didn't know how to reach you when you became so distant." He ran a hand through his hair, visibly agitated. "Distant? You think I wanted this? Do you have any idea what it was like for me when I was trying to make something of myself? I felt like you didn't even notice." Margaret's chest tightened at his words. She had thought about their past so many times, wishing she could take back the moments of anger and misunderstanding. "I was proud of you, David. I just didn't know how to express it when you were so wrapped up in your work." David leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms defensively. "It always came back to work for me. You never understood the sacrifices I had to make to get here." The accusation stung, and Margaret felt tears prick at her eyes. "I did the best I could, David. I worked hard to provide for you. I just wanted you to be happy." His expression softened for a brief moment, but the hardness returned quickly. "Happy? You think I'm happy? I'm stressed, I'm overwhelmed, and I feel like I'm losing everything I've worked for." Margaret swallowed hard, her heart breaking for the son she no longer recognized. "What do you mean? What's going on?" He shook his head, refusing to elaborate, his gaze fixed on the floor. "It doesn't matter. I just needed you to understand that it wasn't easy for me." "I want to understand, David. I do," she pleaded, leaning forward, desperate for a connection. "But you have to let me in. You can't shut me out forever." David looked at her then, his eyes reflecting a mixture of pain and anger. "You don't get it, do you? Every time I try to share something, you just don't understand. You're still stuck in the past, and I've moved on." Margaret felt a cold shiver run through her. The words struck her like a blow, leaving her breathless and speechless. She had come here hoping to find a way back to her son, but instead she felt as if she were being pushed further away. "I'm trying, David. I'm really trying," she whispered, her voice cracking. He stood up abruptly, running a hand through his hair again, pacing the room. "Maybe you should have thought about that before all those years ago, before you let me go." Margaret recoiled as if he had slapped her. "I never let you go, David. You were my world. I just didn't know how to deal with the changes." He turned to face her, his expression fierce. "Well, maybe you should have figured it out, because now it feels like I don't know you at all." The silence that followed was deafening, a chasm of hurt and resentment stretching between them. Margaret's heart shattered as she realized the truth. They were worlds apart, and no amount of coffee or conversation could bridge that gap. As David continued to pace, Margaret felt the tears streaming down her cheeks. She had hoped for reconciliation, for a chance to mend their relationship, but instead she was left with the bitter taste of betrayal and sorrow. The son she had known, the boy she had raised, was slipping through her fingers like sand. "David," she finally managed, her voice raw, "I love you. I always have. I just wanted to be a part of your life again." He paused, looking at her with a mix of confusion and conflict. But before he could respond, the moment was lost, drowned in the weight of unspoken words. Margaret felt a deep sense of loss, realizing that perhaps some doors were meant to remain closed and some relationships were irrevocably broken. Margaret stood in the lavish apartment, her heart racing as the door to the hallway clicked shut behind David, leaving her engulfed in a heavy silence. The remnants of their heated argument echoed in her ears, a painful reminder of the distance that had grown between them over the years. She felt as if a chasm had formed, deep and insurmountable, fueled by resentment and unspoken words. Margaret took a deep breath, trying to steady herself, but the air felt thick with sorrow. As she stood in the immaculately decorated living room, she was struck by the stark contrast between the opulence surrounding her and the emptiness she felt inside. The walls were adorned with paintings of serene landscapes and abstract art that spoke of wealth and success, yet none seemed to reflect the love she had once known. Her fingers grazed the edge of a sleek coffee table, and she wondered how they had arrived at this point, two strangers bound by blood but divided by circumstance. Her gaze shifted down the hallway, where a locked door caught her attention. It stood there, an ominous presence at the end of the corridor, its dark wood contrasting sharply with the bright, airy decor of the apartment. A strange mix of curiosity and dread washed over her. What lay beyond that door? Perhaps it was a storage room, or maybe it held secrets David was not ready to share. The thought of it being a sanctuary for his hidden life made her heart sink. Margaret felt an inexplicable pull toward the door. She hesitated for a moment, glancing back at the living room where memories of laughter and warmth once resided. Taking a tentative step forward, she approached the door, her heart pounding with each stride. She raised her hand and knocked softly, the sound barely echoing in the silence. No response came, and a sense of unease crept over her. With a shaky hand, she grasped the handle and turned it. To her surprise, the door creaked open, revealing a room that took her breath away. It was a stark contrast to the rest of the apartment, a shrine to David's accomplishments. Shelves lined with trophies glinted under the soft light, each one a testament to his hard work and ambition. Awards for excellence in business, recognition for community service, and even a few sports accolades from his youth were meticulously displayed. Margaret stepped inside, her heart heavy with mixed feelings. This was David's world, a world she had been excluded from for far too long. She took a moment to absorb the sight, marveling at the dedication that had gone into achieving these honors, yet feeling a pang of sadness at the thought that they had come at the cost of their relationship. As her eyes scanned the room, they landed on a large framed photo that stood proudly atop a gleaming shelf. Margaret's heart skipped a beat as she recognized the smiling faces of David and Sarah, the assistant who had greeted her upon her arrival. They stood together, arms draped around each other, their faces lit with joy and intimacy. In that moment, the air seemed to thicken, suffocating her with the weight of betrayal. "Why didn't he tell me?" she whispered to herself, her voice trembling. The photo felt like a punch to the gut, a stark reminder that he had built a life without her, a life in which she felt no longer welcome. Anger bubbled within her, mingling with the sadness that had taken root in her heart. She had come here seeking connection, hoping to mend the fractures that had formed over the years, only to find that David had seemingly moved on without her. Margaret's mind raced as she processed the implications of what she had discovered. Had he replaced her? Was Sarah merely an assistant, or was she something more? The questions spiraled in her mind, each one sharper than the last. She felt as though she was standing in quicksand, sinking deeper into a morass of betrayal and confusion. "Margaret," David's voice broke through her thoughts, pulling her back to reality. She turned to see him standing in the doorway, his brow furrowed with concern. "What are you doing in here?" Caught off guard, Margaret felt her defenses rise. "I was just looking," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. David stepped into the room, his eyes darting to the photo that now felt like a wall between them. "You shouldn't be in here," he said, a hint of irritation lining his tone. "It's not meant for visitors." "Visitors?" she echoed, feeling the sting of his words. "Am I not a visitor in your life, David? I came here hoping to see you, to talk about us. Instead, I find this shrine to your achievements and a woman I barely know." He sighed, running a hand through his hair, frustration etched across his face. "It's not like that. You don't understand." "Then help me understand." Margaret's voice rose, fueled by the hurt and anger swirling within her. "You've shut me out for so long, and now I find out that you've built a life here without me. Why? Why couldn't you just tell me about Sarah? Why do I feel like a stranger in my own son's life?" David stepped closer, his expression softening as he met her gaze. "It's complicated, Mom. I didn't want to hurt you. I thought it would be easier this way." "Easier?" she scoffed, her heartache bleeding into her words. "Is this what you call easier? Keeping me in the dark while you live your life? Do you even care how this makes me feel?" "I do care," he replied, his voice rising in defense. "But you don't understand what it's like for me. Everything I've done has been for us, to provide, to succeed. I thought you would be proud." "Proud?" Margaret's voice broke, the weight of her emotions crashing down on her. "Proud of what? Of losing my son to a world that I don't recognize? I wanted to be part of your life, David, not an afterthought." Silence enveloped them, thick and suffocating. David's eyes darted away, as if searching for an escape from the conversation that threatened to unravel everything. "I have to go," he finally muttered, turning on his heel, leaving Margaret standing amidst the trophies and accolades that felt more like chains than accomplishments. As he walked away, Margaret felt the tears welling up in her eyes. She wanted to scream, to chase after him and demand answers, but a part of her felt defeated. The door to the hallway loomed behind him, a stark reminder of the gulf that had grown between them. In that moment, Margaret realized that the journey to reconnect with her son was far more complicated than she had anticipated. The trophies that celebrated his success now felt like barbed wire, encasing him in a world that pushed her further away. She was left in a room filled with echoes of victories that did not include her, grappling with the realization that reconciliation might come at a much higher cost than she had ever imagined. With a heavy heart, she took one last look at the room, her eyes lingering on the photo of David and Sarah. The betrayal mixed with a profound sadness washed over her like a tidal wave, and she knew that the path ahead would be fraught with challenges. The door remained ajar, a symbol of the unresolved tension and the uncertain future that awaited them both. Margaret sat on the plush couch, her heart racing as she waited for David to return. The silence in the apartment was deafening, punctuated only by the distant sounds of the city outside, the honking of cars, the murmur of pedestrians, and the occasional siren wailing in the background. Each tick of the ornate clock on the wall felt like a countdown to an inevitable confrontation, and the weight of the moment pressed heavily on her chest. Her eyes were red and puffy, remnants of the tears she had shed upon discovering the evidence of David's life without her. The photographs of David and Sarah, locked behind that door, haunted her thoughts. How could he have moved on so completely without her? How could he allow her to feel so estranged in his world? When the door finally clicked open, Margaret's breath hitched in her throat. David stepped inside, his expression shifting from surprise to concern as he took in the sight of his mother. The bags under his eyes seemed darker than before, and a sheen of sweat glistened on his forehead, suggesting he had just come from a grueling meeting. "Mum?" he said, his voice low and wary. "What's wrong?" Margaret stood, her body trembling as she tried to compose herself. "David, we need to talk," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She felt a lump in her throat, the words she had rehearsed in her mind scattering like leaves in the wind. David's brow furrowed. "Is it about earlier? I didn't mean to—" "No, it's not just about that," she interrupted, her voice gaining strength. "It's about Sarah. I don't understand. Who is she to you? Why does it feel like she's taken my place in your life?" David's face paled, and he took a step back, a flicker of something, fear perhaps, crossing his features. "Mom, please, it's not like that." "Then tell me what it is," Margaret pressed, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. "I feel like I don't know you anymore. You've built this whole world, and I'm just a stranger in it." He sighed, running a hand through his hair, which had begun to show streaks of grey. "Sarah is my assistant, but she's also my business partner. We work together on a lot of projects. It's complicated, but it's purely professional." "Professional?" she echoed, her voice rising in disbelief. "That's not what it looks like, David. The way you smiled in those pictures." "Mom, I need you to listen to me," he said, his tone growing sharper. "You don't know the pressures I'm under. It's not easy. I've had to make sacrifices, and I've had to rely on people who understand that world. Sarah has always been there for me." "But what about me?" Margaret cried, her voice breaking. "I was there for you when you needed me. I raised you, and now it feels like I'm just an afterthought. It hurts, David. It really hurts." He rubbed his temples, visibly torn. "I never wanted you to feel that way. I thought you would be proud of what I've accomplished." "Proud?" she scoffed, her heart heavy with disappointment. "I am proud, but that doesn't mean I want to be pushed aside. I came here to reconnect, to be part of your life again, but it feels like you've replaced me with her." David's expression softened, and for a brief moment, Margaret saw the boy she had raised, the one who once sought her advice and shared his dreams with her. "Mom, I'm sorry. I didn't realize you felt this way. Maybe I was so focused on my career that I lost sight of what really matters." "David, I don't want to be just a memory to you," she said, her voice trembling. "I want to be part of your life, not just a visitor every few years. I want to know my son again." He looked away, his gaze drifting to the window where the city skyline glimmered against the twilight. "I'm not the same person you remember," he admitted quietly. "So much has changed." "Then let me in," she pleaded, stepping closer. "Help me understand. I want to know what you're going through. I want to support you, but I can't do that if you keep me at arm's length." David turned back to her, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I've been so focused on success that I forgot what really matters. I've been trying to prove something. To myself, to everyone else. I thought that if I worked hard enough, I could—" I could make everything right. Margaret's heart ached for him. You don't have to do it alone, David. You never did. Just as the moment seemed to shift toward healing, the doorbell rang, slicing through the fragile atmosphere. Both of them turned toward the sound, the tension in the room palpable once more. Who could that be? David asked, looking puzzled. I don't know, Margaret replied, her heart racing again. Maybe it's Sarah. David frowned, hesitating for a moment before crossing the room to answer the door. Margaret's stomach churned with anxiety, the previous conversation hanging in the air like a fragile thread, ready to snap. When David opened the door, a man in a tailored suit stepped inside. He had an air of urgency about him, and Margaret felt an instinctive apprehension wash over her. "Good evening, Mr. Wright," the man said, offering a firm handshake. "I'm Alan, and I need to speak with you and your mother about something important." Margaret's brow furrowed. "What is this about?" she asked, her voice steady despite the flutter of nerves in her stomach. Alan turned his gaze to her, his expression a mix of sympathy and seriousness. "Margaret, I understand this is unexpected, but we need to discuss some urgent matters regarding your late husband's estate." "Estate?" Margaret repeated, bewildered. "What do you mean? I thought everything was settled." David's face grew pale, and he stepped back, clearly unsettled. "What's going on, Alan?" Alan opened a folder he was carrying and glanced between them, his demeanor growing even more serious. "There have been complications. David, we need to address some legal issues that could affect both of you significantly." Margaret felt her heart drop. "What kind of complications?" Alan took a deep breath, his eyes locking onto hers. "You need to know that David isn't the only one with a stake in this estate. You have a half-brother, Margaret." The words hung heavily in the air, and Margaret felt the ground shift beneath her. Confusion and disbelief washed over her, and she struggled to process the revelation. David's face mirrored her shock, and the room was filled with an oppressive silence, the gravity of the situation settling in. "What?" she finally managed to whisper, her mind racing. "A half-brother? How is that even possible?" Alan began to explain, but Margaret felt as if the world was spinning around her. The last remnants of her earlier confrontation with David faded into the background as she grappled with this new reality. Her heart raced, and the room felt constricting, a whirlwind of emotions swirling within her. In that moment, the door to silence had swung wide open, revealing not only the pain of estrangement, but also the complexities of family ties, legacy, and the unknown paths that lay ahead. David opened the door, and the air shifted in the room, thick with an unspoken tension. A man in a sharply tailored suit stepped inside, exuding an air of urgency that instantly captured Margaret's attention. His dark hair was slicked back, and his expression reflected a blend of sympathy and determination. "Margaret, I'm Alan," he said, his voice steady yet filled with an undercurrent of concern. He carried a folder that seemed to bulge with documents. "You need to hear this." David's brows furrowed, and he exchanged a glance with Margaret that conveyed confusion and unease. "What's going on?" he asked, crossing his arms defensively. Alan glanced at David, then turned his gaze back to Margaret, who was now standing frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. "There are some urgent matters regarding your husband's estate. I know this is unexpected, but it's crucial that you understand what's at stake." Margaret felt a wave of nausea wash over her. Her husband? The mention of her late spouse sent her spiraling back to the day she lost him, a day filled with heartbreak and questions left unanswered. "What do you mean?" she managed to ask, her voice trembling. Alan opened the folder, revealing a series of documents filled with legal jargon and numbers that made Margaret's head spin. "David has been involved in a legal battle concerning his father's estate. There are complications related to the will that could affect your future, Margaret. Margaret's mind raced. She had come to reconnect with David, to bridge the chasm that had grown between them, only to find herself ensnared in a web of legal troubles. "What kind of complications?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Alan took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "There are claims that have been made regarding the distribution of assets. David has made some decisions that could jeopardize your inheritance." David shifted uncomfortably, his expression hardening. "What are you saying, Alan? I've handled everything according to the law." Margaret's heart sank as she turned to her son. "David, what have you done?" she questioned, her voice rising with a mix of anger and despair. She felt as if the ground beneath her was crumbling. Alan interjected, "It's not just about legality, it's about family. There are elements at play here that you both need to be aware of." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle. "You have a half-brother, Margaret." The revelation struck her like a thunderbolt. "A half-brother?" Margaret gasped, her face paling. "What do you mean?" David's eyes widened in shock, and for a moment he looked like a deer caught in headlights. "This doesn't make sense. How can I have a half-brother?" He turned to Alan, desperation creeping into his voice. "You must be mistaken." Alan held up a hand, urging calm. "I assure you this information is accurate. Your father had a relationship prior to his marriage to your mother. There are legal implications that tie your half-brother to the estate." Margaret felt as though the walls were closing in on her. Memories of her husband flooded her mind, the love they shared, the life they built together. How could he have hidden something so monumental? "Why didn't anyone tell me?" she asked, her voice cracking. Alan hesitated, his gaze softening. "Sometimes families choose to keep certain truths hidden, even if it leads to more complications down the line. Your half-brother is entitled to a portion of the estate, and it's important for you to understand how this affects you." David clenched his fists, frustration boiling over. "This isn't fair. I've worked my entire life to secure what's rightfully mine. Now, suddenly, there's someone else." His voice was laced with bitterness, and Margaret could see the turmoil churning within him. "David, this isn't about fairness," Alan replied calmly. "This is about the law and what's just. We need to approach this situation with caution. If we don't address it properly, you could risk losing everything." Margaret's thoughts were a whirlwind. She had come to mend her relationship with David, yet now they stood on opposite sides of a legal battle that neither of them had anticipated. "What are we supposed to do now?" she asked, her voice trembling. Alan looked at both of them, his expression serious. "You need to come together as a family. This is a difficult time, and I understand that emotions are running high. But you both have to decide how you want to handle this moving forward." David's jaw tightened, and Margaret could feel the walls between them growing higher. "I don't even know this person. How can I possibly accept him as my brother?" he spat, anger spilling from him like poison. "David," Margaret said softly, her heart aching for her son, "we don't know anything yet. It's not fair to judge someone we've never met." She placed a hand on his arm, hoping to bridge the growing divide. "We need to understand the situation before we make any decisions." Alan nodded, appreciating her perspective. "That's the best approach. There will be a meeting to discuss the estate in the coming weeks. I suggest both of you attend. It's crucial that you present a united front." "United front?" David echoed, his voice incredulous. "You expect me to work together with someone I don't even know?" Margaret's heart sank further. She had come to restore their bond, only to find it fraying at the seams. "David, please," she implored. "This is our chance to be a family. We can't let pride tear us apart." He shook his head, stepping back. "I need time to think," he muttered, his voice cold and distant. "This is too much." Alan glanced between them, sensing the rift growing wider. "I understand this is overwhelming," he said gently, "but you both need to navigate this together. Family is complicated, but it's also the only way forward." Margaret felt a knot tightening in her stomach as she watched her son retreat further into himself. "David, please don't shut me out," she pleaded, tears welling in her eyes. "I'm here for you, no matter what." David turned away, his back rigid. "I just need to understand everything first," he said, his voice muffled. "I can't focus on this right now." Alan, sensing the gravity of the moment, took a step back. "I'll give you both some time to process this," he said. "But remember, the clock is ticking. We need to act sooner rather than later." As Alan left, the door swung shut, leaving Margaret alone in the silence that followed, the weight of unspoken words hanging heavily in the air. She felt the sting of betrayal, not just from David, but from the universe itself. Her hopes of rekindling their bond had been dashed, and now she was faced with a new reality that threatened to unravel everything she thought she knew about her family. With the door left ajar, the world outside continued to move, oblivious to the turmoil inside. Margaret stood at the threshold of her past and future, grappling with the implications of a half-brother she had never known, a new path stretching before her, filled with uncertainty and the need for resilience. How would she navigate this uncharted territory, and what would it mean for her relationship with David? The questions loomed large as she braced herself for the journey ahead.